You're looking at the brand new Rawrr Mantis X, a bike that I am so excited to finally share with you on this channel. It is a surron competitor that is both cheaper and more capable in almost every single way. This thing has an impeccable spec sheet, all the features, power that you want, considering the price. But the question here is it too good to be true, or does the bike actually deliver on the spec sheet? And that's what we're going to be focusing on in this video. Well guys, here is the brand new Mantis X. I am so excited for this bike. I think it has a real potential to be a complete game changer in the e-moto space. So this thing is only $3,000, at least as of right now. And they hit all the main numbers on the spec sheet. So it's 72 volts, 30 amp hours of capacity. Of course, that's not the biggest battery ever, but 30 amp hours, being able to hit that number, very strong selling point. That battery supplies this massive mid-drive motor, which by the way, it says right here is the QS60 with nominal 3,000 watts of power and a peak up to 6.5 kilowatts. That's slightly higher than the usual 6 kilowatt peak we usually see on bikes in this category. And of course, the design here is super slick, completely redesigned compared to their original Mantis. And I think this is much more in line with what people want. It's smaller, more compact, and still 72 volts. The weight here is 139 pounds. So it's not light, but the way that the center of mass is with the battery, the huge motor, it is very low, and thus when riding it, it is very comfortable, but more on the comfort in a second. Some other things to point out here is that the drivetrain is different than a surron. So the surron has something like this, where there's a primary belt that brings the rotation to the axle, and then there's a secondary chain that brings that power to the rear wheel. Here it's, I guess, more simplified. The chain crosses over the axle, which has its pros and cons. The pro is that there's less moving parts, but the con is that potentially there could be issues with the chain falling off the sprocket. But you can see here they have a very adequate chain guard, which in theory will prevent the chain from falling off, right? It guards it and keeps it on the sprocket. Of course, this bike is full suspension. The front, we have the pretty standard inverted front fork. It feels fantastic. I don't see any branding on the fork. Oh wait, KKE, okay. It's a KKE fork. Something I always want in my forks is a direct mount handlebar, and that's exactly what we have here. So that way you don't have to worry about the alignment of the handlebars with your fork. The last thing I'll point out here about this fork, which is actually a really big deal, is the fork lock. Just like that, boom, fork is locked, more or less into position. For the rear shock, this thing is absolutely huge, and there's no linkage here. I know a lot of people prefer the linkage, and my quick opinion on the linkage is if you do a lot of off-road jumping in particular, yes, a linkage is crucial. But for on-road riding and light off-road riding, I prefer no linkage. Less moving parts, less things to go wrong, and it provides you with a linear curve to the suspension. The shock here is KKE, same as the front fork. And the overall geometry here is essentially perfect. Okay, and two last quick things before jumping on. The brake calipers, 4-piston, right? So we have 2 on either side. That's good. Although, unfortunately, there's no, as of right now, regen braking on this bike. That's unfortunate. Regen braking is like my favorite thing. So hopefully in the future, there can be a software update that enables that feature. But as of right now, there is only physical friction brakes. Kind of a hard miss on that one. And then the last thing here is the seat. This has a very both wide and long seat. So that allows you to adjust where you sit on the bike to have the ergonomics that you want at that moment in time. And it's also like so plushy. I think this is the most comfortable bike seat I've ever experienced. Now hopping on the bike, on that very comfortable seat. Immediately, the suspension just gave like 3 inches. It's very floaty suspension. But to turn on the bike, there's a key ignition right here. Below that, by the way, is the charging port. You can, of course, take out the battery, plug it in directly. I'll show you guys how to do that later. And while I'm here, there actually is a USB charging port. It's not here like it is on the Surron, I believe. There's a little flap under the display, and this gives you access to a USB-C charging port. Very handy feature, and something you guys definitely should know about. Now let's do this. We're gonna immediately start with some off-roading here. All right, let's talk about power. So the spec sheet, this is slightly more powerful than a Surron, other comparable bikes, peak power of 6,500 watts. And I can say when riding this, it does translate. This is a very powerful, snappy, responsive bike. The Surron can like barely hit like, what is it, 42 miles per hour on a full charge. This thing has a speed limiter on 50 miles per hour. So this is more powerful than a Surron. A lot of that comes down to not just the wattage, but the fact that this is running at 72 volts. Yeah, there's something special about 72 volt bikes. They just feel different, man. I just wish this thing had regen braking. I mean, the 4-piston calipers are okay, but regen in combination with physical brakes is always going to give you superior stopping power. Now you guys can listen to the bike and let me know in the comments what you think. Is it too loud? To me it sounds pretty average for a mid-drive with a chain. I probably should have mentioned before when I was talking about the drivetrain, but this does not have a primary belt drive, as mentioned, but it does have an internal gearbox, not too dissimilar from the Teleria's. So that should be quieter, I guess, right, having that internal gearbox. But it does unfortunately mean that every 600 miles, you have to do a basic oil change on your electric bike. So kind of a good news, bad news situation right there. But here's a good launch. Oh my gosh, I had to roll onto that throttle. Yeah, this thing has a ton of power. This feels, okay, if you want my honest opinion here, this feels like at least a $5,000 bike. I cannot believe this thing is 3,000 bucks. I mean, I had high expectations because the spec sheet is so strong, but I had my doubts because the price was so low how well it would translate into a final product. But I can tell you guys, this thing, it feels fantastic, and I can't believe it's $3,000. Yeah, I just hit the speed limiter. Of course, we're going downhill, but that was a hard just cut off at 50 miles per hour. It could do more. And as you saw right there, we do have integrated headlight. You know, let's talk about this for a second here, because this is kind of weird. So on the left side, this over here controls the modes, and then of course your throttle. On the left side here, we have lighting controls. It's basic low beam. I don't know if you guys can kind of see it. Low beam, high beam. I'm not even sure if there's much of a difference there. And then there is a horn. But I noticed that there's no tail light, like not even a basic one. So that kind of sucks. So we have headlight, looks kind of cool. The headlight is always on, by the way, so there's high beams, low beams, but there's no way to fully disable it. And no tail light. But the bike does look so clean. Okay, it's the next morning. I was doing a little photo shoot here in its natural habitat. A few things I want to say. I'm not a big fan of the stock tires, extremely knobby, and they're pretty squirrely on the road, at least in their new-ish state. So personally, I know the tires is something I'm going to be changing. Now, in terms of sizing, The rim here says 17 times 1.85, but the tire says 17 times 2.75. If you go ahead and measure this live, yeah, okay, it's definitely 2.75. This is also probably a good time to mention that the rear wheel, the diameter, is 17 inches. The front, 19 inches. So we got that going on. Now, I did ask the company what's the widest tire you can put on this bike, and they said they didn't know. But if we take a look at the swing arm here, there is plenty of room. The closest inhibitor will be the chain, which by the way is on the left-hand side of the bike. But if I take my Imperial System ruler, we have exactly 1 inch of clearance from the stock tire. By the way, super beefy kickstand, big fan of that. But the seat here, as I already touched on, it's like 7 inches wide. It's rounded, which is actually surprisingly okay because the padding here is phenomenal. But something I didn't already show you guys is how you remove the seat. So there's a key right here. Insert the key, it's spring loaded, and you kind of slide it back a little bit. Oh yeah, so grab it like that, slide it back, comes off super easy, just one piece. And this is how you access the battery. Battery, as a reminder, 72 volts, 30 amp hours, and it connects to the bike via one solid waterproof-ish plug. I did ask the company if this has an IP rating, and this is what they said. As you would imagine, you can charge the battery separately. That's the charging port. We even have a battery indicator, so that's cool. But the charger on this bike, it's 6 amps. It's a 6 amp charger. That's okay, but it's not fast. A fast charger would be 10 amps plus. Okay, shall we do some light off-roading? I have 11 miles on the bike. When I first got it, I charged it to 100%. And I'm down to essentially half battery, 53%, via only 11 miles. I'm not gonna do like a full range test in this video. Maybe my next video can be a range test. I'm definitely gonna have more videos on this bike, so if you wanna see more content on it, subscribe to the channel. You know, now that I have 11 miles of ride time on this bike, we're doing it. We're doing it. I have ridden this more as an e-bike on the side of the road. This is a big bump, but I know I have the power. Oh my gosh, like nothing. That was like a 6-inch root. Oh my gosh, wow, okay. That was nothing for this bike. I know on the action camera, the terrain part looks flat, but that was pretty steep with huge roots and no problem. But yeah, like I was saying, I was riding this bike more as a bike just to see how it feels. And yeah, it feels fine. So if you want to ride this as a bike, you know, not fully legally, of course, I think it feels okay. I didn't feel goofy doing that. So far, I have very positive opinions on this bike. Even now that I'm down to 50% battery, the peppiness here is still, I don't really think it diminished at all. I mean, if I just give it a little twist, I have all the power I could ever want. And the bike kind of sounds cool. The bike has a unique sound to it. This is full throttle, by the way, on half battery. Slight downhill. Okay, I'm gonna respect the speed limit here. But yeah, it's still very peppy. I'm still satisfied with the power. 6,500 watts. I mean, this thing has plenty of kick at 72 volts. So much fun to ride. I'm just a little hesitant on the road here taking corners because these tires, these knobby tires, just don't feel fantastic.
Everybody, move your body.
All right, but to wrap up this first video before it gets too long, overall, the bike delivers. It's fantastic, and above all else, it is just fun to ride. Lots of power, great handling, very ergonomic and comfortable. It really doesn't feel or even look like a $3,000 bike. But it's not perfect. Like any bike, it could have improvements, and there's 3 big ones. Point 1 is the lighting. The headlight is pretty dull, there's no blinkers, and not even a tail light. So the lighting kit is very bad on this bike. -2 is the noise. This bike does make a lot of sound, and in my opinion, I think they should offer a belt drive version. This would substantially reduce the noise, maintenance, and even save some weight on the overall bike, which could help to extend the range. And speaking of range and battery, point 3 is the lack of regen. This bike needs regen. It would significantly increase the stopping power, save wear and tear on the brake pads, and yes, slightly extend the range a little bit. But overall, there are many more pros and cons for this vehicle. If you have any questions, leave a comment below and I'll address it in a future video. I'll also leave the product linked below, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.